Welcome to tonight's research event, DiabetesChat research event. I'm going to keep my intro short and sweet. Tonight we have 6 amazing researchers who will be joining us and sharing a little bit about them and their diabetes research, who are joining us from all across the world. We have Diana, Hilary from JDRF, Jonathan, Dean, Jacq, and Jasmine. So 6 speakers. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to talk and share their intro and a little bit about them and their diabetes research, and then we'll pass the baton on to the next speaker until around 10 o'clock, where we'll have a Q&A session. And if the speakers are able to stay on, that's great, and we can have more Q&As, questions, and get the community involved, and everyone can have a great chat with the researchers. So without further ado, I'm going to head over to Tony, and he's going to intro our first speaker for the evening, and then we'll start our DiabetesChat research event. Enjoy, guys, and you can tweet along, #DiabetesChat, and later on request a microphone or tweet any questions or any comments at the guest as well. So you can tag them in the DiabetesChat account, and we'll get them questions to them. All right, cheers, Tony.
Excellent, thanks, Tom. So we'll jump straight in there with our first amazing guest speaker of tonight, Dr. Diana Ferro. So Dr. Diana Ferro is a researcher and data scientist at the Bambino Gesù Pediatric Hospital. She's an expert in the field of artificial intelligence in medicine, with a focus on pediatrics. She's passionate about using data and technology to make a positive impact on people's lives, and is dedicated to finding new and innovative ways to tackle the challenges faced by those living with diabetes. So Diana, you're our first guest speaker tonight. Take it away.
Hi, first of all, thank you everybody to invite me today. I'm actually sometimes joining this group here and there when I can, because I'm very passionate about hearing the patient perspective about diabetes, because all my research is based on patient-centric design. Before starting officially, we were talking a little bit about data and about FASTI data. Explain you. FASTI data are data that are not standardized and not harmonized. They're data that come from medical record devices, in your case, glucose monitors, pumps, closed loop, open loops, and maybe even your phone, your watches, and medical record and genome data, and so on and so on. And so in my research, basically, take all of this and trying to predict the future, to prevent anything bad happen, but also provide you with support so you can have a good life. My research has 3 aspects: is preventive, predictive, and proactive, meaning that I'm trying to get out of this idea that we can only look at the past, but we can both jump to the future by providing a transformative approach that moves us away from what we call a retrospective study into actionable research and almost real-time data-driven decision-making for the patients and for the providers. I spent 10 and plus years training to become a multidisciplinary researcher, meaning that I bring together different fields. I understand very well genomics and genetics, so all things DNAs, because I do have a PhD in biology too. But I also do a ton of healthcare informatics and a little bit of medicine, although I'm not a practitioner. But I do support practitioners. So I sit down every day close to pediatricians right now in my hospital, the Bambino Gesù, and I talk to them and hear about what I can do to make their life easier, the patient life better, and overall a common, I would say, battle to get those improvement in technology that allow us to provide you guys with a better life. So that's what I do very quickly. I'm very passionate, that's right, about data. And ideally, I get all of it, everything. Mental health type of features, love that. Behavioral features coming from your genes, love that too. I worked a little bit also collecting what we call social determinant of health when I was in the United States doing my postdoc and my professorship. So try really to make the AI less biased possible, because I want to feed these models with whatever I can find. And I don't care if it's not standardized or messy. I want it to be messy because we are complex, and the only way to train this AI is providing them complex data, because we can leverage those incredible technologies such as deep learning and machine learning to provide us with information and see things that we might not be able to think. Think about how big is the genome. Think about how big is your everyday life and how much data you're collecting, even if you're wearing a glucose monitor. So I want all of it, basically, and I want to use it to create a better world for you guys. So that's basically what I'm very passionate about, and I also love to hear the opinion of the community. In the last 2 years, I have been bringing in patients and ask questions about what you guys want from us, because our role in society is actually serve you. What you want to see in the future, what you don't want to wait for. That's my mission, that's my goal, and I am very blessed to be able to do that in my current hospital in Italy. So I come back from United States after 5 years in the United States just to bring in Europe that cutting edge technology that will improve life for kids worldwide.
Excellent, thank you, Diana. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Does anyone have any questions for Diana at this point? No, that's excellent. Thanks for that. Very clear and concise from you there, Diana. Just a reminder to anybody listening, if you've got any questions that you would like to raise, you can just drop them into the hashtag. It's hashtag DiabetesChat. We've got Flipper coming on. Try to get her approved onto the panel.
And if anyone has any questions, like Tony says, you can hashtag DiabetesChat, or later on we'll have a Q&A with all our panelists, and we can continue the discussion that we had before, which would be good. And yeah, lots of comments and questions will be appreciated for the speakers later on. I've just tried to send a request to Hilary as well, so we can bring her up as our next speaker. Well, thank you so much, Diana.
You're welcome. I was very quick, as always. I guess I will leave more time later on for questions. I actually prefer hearing questions than prepare speech, because I really like to be here as a service to answer questions more than actually give you a speech.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's hand over to Gary. Is Gary still there? And he's going to introduce our next speaker. Over to you, Gary.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. So next speaker we have is Hilary. Now, Hilary is the Director of Policy and Communications at JDRF UK. Hilary has been integral to, sorry, my speaking's bad tonight, it's fuzzy brain night tonight, integral to the JDRF's role in bringing hybrid closed loops, which is amazing, to the NHS, as well as spearheading out type 1 DE campaigns, which I am assuming is type 1. Let me get to this. My brain's not working. She also oversees all the JDRF UK communications, including sharing news from our thriving research portfolio, so you know that JDRF's research spans is huge. What else? And obviously they are trying to treat and cure type 1 diabetes. So this is Hilary for you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Fantastic. So hello, I'm Hilary. Thanks, Gary, for the introduction. So I'm the Director for Policy and Communications for JDRF UK. So there's actually, with JDRF UK, there's JDRF in the US, that's our mothership. And there's JDRF Canada and Australia, Israel and the Netherlands. And what makes us different is that we all raise money in our different countries, and then we have a central research program out of New York, JDRF International, to fund the best research in the world. So we really work beyond borders, and we work to prevent, treat and cure type 1, both biomedically in terms of the actual cures, but we also work to accelerate access to treatments in our own countries, and increasingly with a focus on kind of global and emerging and developing countries as well. So JDRF in total spends around $200 million, which is about 160 million pounds a year on type 1 diabetes research. And we work in partnership with medical research councils and National Institute of Health Research, statutory forms of research, the leading universities, and also with the type 1 community, both online and in different countries. So I'm really proud to work for JDRF. I think we achieve incredible things by working together and in partnership. So what I thought I'd do is I just thought I'd go through kind of like some of the key points of some of the kind of research that we're involved in. So you may have heard of teplizumab. This was announced last November. It's the world's first type 1 diabetes disease modifying drug. And it was approved by the USA's Food and Drug Administration last year as an immunotherapy drug to delay the onset of type 1 by up to 3 years in high-risk individuals. So instead of treating type 1 in terms of insulin, this actually goes to the heart of type 1 diabetes being a malfunctioning of the immune system, and it actually tackles some of the root causes of the immune condition. And we know at the moment it halts it halts by up to 3 years, but we also know we're right at the beginning of this journey in terms of immunotherapies. And so what the potential for this drug is absolutely huge. So it's the first time the food that any country has approved a treatment to delay the onset of type 1. In the meantime, we fund several other studies around immunotherapies to delay the onset, including several in the UK. There's one called the ustekinumab, I always get it wrong, ustekinumab trial. And we hope
they don't make it easy for you, do they, Hilary?
They really don't make it easy for me. But we hope that a combination of these immunotherapies, so actually looking at how the immune system malfunctions and addressing that eventually will be able to completely stop T1D from developing. Now, we know peak age of diagnosis is between the age of 9 to 14. Obviously, people do develop it all the way through their lives, from children into adulthood. But we know that this drug, if we were to be able to delay it 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, we would be more or less able to give children their childhood back. And crucially, we would be able to ensure that the pancreas can grow into adult size with an adult set of beta cells. So at the moment, the younger you are, the fewer they're clusters of beta cells which produce the insulin. They're called islets. The fewer you have of beta cells, because your pancreas is that much smaller. So the sort of this short-term aim is very much to delay the onset, particularly in children, so that their pancreases can grow to full size. And also because we know that the ages of moving into adolescence is particularly difficult for children. So we all know insulin's a hormone, and we all know during puberty the hormones go, and adolescence the hormones go wild. So it becomes really difficult to actually manage biologically insulin and blood glucose sugar levels during adolescence. Psychologically, it's a period of huge development where children need to separate from their parents psychologically. And for a lot of children and young people, that means not doing what your parents have told, not sticking to the routine. It means rebelling a bit. It means doing your own thing, taking a few risks. All of that is totally normal and totally natural. But with type 1 diabetes, it's that much harder. So this short-term aim is really to eliminate type 1 in childhood, and then from then on to then actually be able to prevent it through the whole life course. So the next question is, what's the point of an immunotherapy, a treatment that addresses the malfunctioning immune system, if you don't know even if you're likely to develop type 1? So that's where screening programs, and there's one called the ELSA study that we co-fund with Diabetes UK. So it screens young people for risk factors for type 1. And that means we can predict pretty accurately if somebody's likely to develop type 1. So there are particular markers. So there are autoantibodies, and with raised levels of those autoantibodies and a chemical called C-peptides, we can actually see the likelihood of developing type 1. But screening is really expensive, and the case has to be made economically for the health service to invest in childhood baby screening, that actually the costs of screening are worth it economically in the long term, in terms of being able to delay type 1, being able to delay the onset of things like diabetes, DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, etc. So the ELSA study is currently recruiting families that have got children who don't have type 1 between the ages of 3 and 13, a mass trial to try to identify who might be likely to develop it. And because we know that there's a genetic predisposition, doesn't mean you necessarily will develop it in families, but we know that there's a lot of autoimmune conditions running through families, and that there is a genetic predisposition. There are families who have one child who's got type 1, or a parent with type 1 who are choosing to go through this screening, so that they know what to look out for and they know what the risk might be. So without screening programs, immunotherapy just doesn't work, because we need to catch it before. People need to be given this treatment before they develop it. So we want to find children at risk of the condition before they start becoming unwell. So screening gives us that opportunity to test those treatments to delay that start. So that's a little bit about prevention. But what about people who already live with type 1? So hybrid closed loop, I'm sure everybody here is aware of hybrid closed loop, and an algorithm that basically connects glucose readings from a CGM or flash with an insulin pump, and through a mechanism of machine learning actually learns that individual person's metabolism. And although people still have to bolus, it then administers insulin automatically 24 hours a day. So it really lifts the burden of self-managing that insulin dosing, and the research has shown that actually it achieves huge improvements in time and range. So there's both the biomedical outcome that means a reduction in hypers, and long-term a reduction in complications, but it also psychologically will really help to just lift that thundering burden of always having to check your blood glucose, always having to dose, always having to be on it 24 hours a day. So we took the decision about 16 years ago to fund hybrid closed loop. And at that point, it really was kind of science fiction. We had pumps, we had, glucose monitors, first, second generation. But the idea of this algorithm that really can learn each individual person's metabolism and be able to dose was quite science fiction. And it's been very much led out of Britain, and the University of Cambridge with Professor Roman Havorka has really, really led the field in hybrid closed loop. And we're incredibly proud that now NICE have made draft recommendations that this be approved for England and Wales for a certain kind of cohort of people living with type 1. The news on the street at the moment is that there's wrangling around money between the medical technology companies and NHS England. That was kind of to be expected, but there'll be a final meeting of the NICE committee end of May. JDRF is a stakeholder and a consultee in that process, so look out for an announcement from NICE in early to mid-June, but we're confident we'll get it through. Some of the other things that Roman is doing now, and what I really love about Professor Roman Havorka, is that he's got such a curiosity that as soon as he's sorted one thing out, he's on to the next thing. So now what he's looking at is whether, and this is the hypothesis that he's got to prove, is whether the use of hybrid closed loop in small children recently diagnosed can actually preserve beta cell function. So he's moving the hybrid closed loop from a system of insulin dosing and management into beta cell preservation, which for me is part of the cure. So that's tremendously exciting. That's going to be another 3 or 4 years before we get kind of like full results on it, but it just shows the boundaries that Roman is really pushing. Some of the other areas, novel insulins. So hybrid closed loop, as I said, it's great, but it's not perfect yet, because people still have to bolus, and they have to calculate their carbohydrate intake. And the reason for that is that insulin just isn't responsive. The current forms of insulin just aren't responsive enough. So if we get quicker acting and more responsive insulins, then hybrid closed loop really can become more like an artificial pancreas function. Whereas at the moment, because of the current formation of insulin, it's just a bit too slow. So we're working with industry to develop new types of insulin, like ultra rapid insulins, which can work much faster than standard insulin, and then they can remove themselves much more quickly too. So insulin is really important if we want to develop fully automated hybrid closed loop. So that's a piece of work which JDRF are funding with the Steve Morgan Foundation, funding which is £50 million of research funding for cures. So that's between Diabetes UK and ourselves. It's over 5 years, and it's looking at beta cell regeneration, novel insulins, and tackling the causes of the autoimmune condition of type 1 diabetes. And then the other thing that's really interesting is cell therapies. So at the moment, beta cell transplants are only available to a very few people under specific conditions, and they come with a burden of immunosuppressants. So you have to take immunosuppressants all your life for your body to accept those beta cell transplants. So JDRF are funding a wide range of projects either to develop new insulin-making beta cells from our own bodies, which is through the use of kind of stem cells, and whether we can remake stem cells from somebody's body into beta cells, or finding a way of hiding these cells from the immune system so that we don't have the issue of immunosuppression. And probably the most well-known of this project is Doug Melton's work, which has actually led to one man. At the moment, he's patient 1 in the world. His name is Brian Shelton. But he's had a set of beta cell. Doug Melton has made these beta cells out of stem cells in the laboratory, and then he's coated them with a degree with immunosuppressant properties, and then inserted them into Brian Shelton. And Brian is now has been insulin independent for 3 years now. So his body is making insulin from those beta cells, which is incredibly exciting. And over Christmas, I was given a book, and it was called The Song of the Cell, and it's by a Pulitzer writing author called Siddhartha Mukherjee. And this book, The Song of the Cell, was the Economist Book of the Year. And you open the book, and within 3 pages, they're talking about stem cell treatments in type 1 diabetes. And on page 300, they've got a whole set of pages about what is happening in type 1 diabetes in cellular treatments. And for me, that's what gives me the crackle of excitement about JDRF's research. This isn't just this is obviously vital for people with type 1, but this is the real golden age of medical research, and type 1 diabetes research is right there, crackling at the front with potential and with evidence and with rigor. This is really showing the world the boundaries and the potential of medical research, and type 1 research is right there at the forefront. So we're really proud. We've been working with Doug Melton for about 15 years. He's a really interesting man, because he was doing some form of research in an area completely unrelated to type 1. He was at Harvard, and he was a professor at Harvard. He got married, he had children, he had twins called Simon and Emma, and they both were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So he flipped his research. He flipped his whole world and focus of work, and he focused it on type 1 diabetes. And as a result of his work, he developed a company that has then been purchased by a large pharmaceutical called Semma, which is the mix of Simon and Emma after his children. And he will get to a form of these cellular cures. We can see it with Brian Shelton. So, you know, it's a really, really exciting time in terms of stem cell transplants and encapsulation, putting stem cells in a with a covering of immunosuppressant treatment, so that the immune system doesn't attack these areas. So a couple of other things. While we're making these headways in the biomedical, we're aware that the burden of type 1, and we're aware that it's tough, and that what we hear from people with type 1 is about 1 in 2 people feel that type 1 adversely affects their mental health in a really significant way. And so what we need to do is, when we go to the health regulators, the people that approve the treatments, the health economics, etc., we need to make sure that we're not just looking at what the burden is of managing the biological condition, but actually looking at a person in the whole. It's about looking at their physical health and their mental health, and what is the burden. So over about the last 4 or 5 years, JDRF has been developing more research and funding more research into psychosocial. So an example of that is we're funding a lot of research both in the UK and internationally into type 1 disordered eating. We know that around 30% of people living with type 1 have a form of disordered eating, that's probably subclinical, that's not a kind of diagnosis of an eating disorder, but have an uneasy relationship with food just because they're always having to count those carbohydrates. They're having to treat themselves. You're having to treat yourselves with orange juice and jelly babies, and then you go for your appointment and you're put on the scales. And so it's inextricable, the relationship between food and type 1 diabetes. Now, a subset of that 30% will then go on and develop a clinically diagnosed eating disorder. We call it TIDE, type 1 disordered eating. It can be both. It can range from binging and purging, bulimia, anorexia, and also a form of, specifically for people with type 1, a form of insulin emission. The causes are complicated. We need more research into it. It's probably a mixture of people feeling vulnerable anyway, people who've gone through some form of trauma, and that might be the trauma of diagnosis in DKA, or it might be another form of trauma. People who've got coexisting conditions of anxiety, people who then have found that the pressure to be thin, the pressure to be beautiful, body image is also strenuous and challenging on top of an incurable condition. But what we do know is at the moment, in the health service, there's a few good pilots, which are at King's College London and coming out of one of the Dorset hospitals in Bournemouth, and a few other pilots. But actually what we need is much more multidisciplinary working between eating disorder units and diabetes clinics in order to treat the whole person. So diabetes clinics are often looking at your HbA1c and they're weighing you and everything, and they're telling you how to treat your, self-manage. And eating disorder clinics are, you've got to eat 3 meals, 3 snacks a day, and you shouldn't be counting your food, you need to be intuitive eating, and people are falling between the cracks. So we're doing research around that, around some of the best clinical interventions that can be evidence-based and therefore rolled out and funded. But we're also doing a parliamentary inquiry at the moment with Theresa May, who's our global research ambassador, and an MP called Sir George Howarth. Sir George Howarth is MP for Knowlesy near Liverpool. It's on his Wikipedia page. He had a daughter with type 1, and his daughter died from complications of type 1. And for that very reason, he is involved in the TIDE parliamentary inquiry. So there's 2 parliamentarians are chairing it, and JDRF are providing the secretariat. We're arranging the evidence sessions, we're writing the reports, and that's set to launch in June this year. So really, I think I've pretty much gone beyond my time. But just finally, I touched on this type 1 diabetes grand challenge. So Steve Morgan's stepson was diagnosed with type 1, and he's been a huge supporter of ours. And 2 years ago, we started having conversations about funding research, and he's now funding around £50 million in type 1 research. And the research calls have gone out, and the research is starting this year. So exciting times. Thank you very much for having me on the Diabetes Chat.
Excellent, thanks, Hilary. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Lots of interesting discussion there. And if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask on the back of that, you can put them into the hashtag DiabetesChat, and we will get them over during the panel discussion later on. But we'll crack on with our third speaker of tonight, Jonathan Golding. Jonathan is a specialist registrar in diabetes and endocrinology working in Sussex, and is currently completing his PhD in diabetes and older adults. The aim of the project is to investigate the interaction between type 1 diabetes in older people and frailty. He hopes this will help us to address the specific needs of older adults with type 1 diabetes and to help them live independently in the community for longer. Jonathan, if you would like to kick things off.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the diabetes chat. I was really amazed how many different bits of research Hilary was able to cover, and thankfully I've only got one project to tell you guys about. And I was also interested to hear the chat before we started, because of the people that were mentioning sort of frustration about not being involved in research, and that's one of the things I'm hopefully trying to tackle with my project by expanding it to older adults with type 1. But yeah, I'll just tell you about the concept first, which arose quite early on in my training in diabetes, where I came across quite a few cases in the hospital where older adults with type 1 would be admitted, and we found it very difficult to support them to live independently in the community. And unfortunately for them, they ended up requiring care. And I kind of found that to be a little bit difficult to handle and sort of like a bit unfair in many ways. So I wanted to try and find out ways in which I could help these people to perhaps live in the communities for longer. So I turned to the world of literature, and I was absolutely shocked to find that there is so little out there that covers the topic of type 1 in older adults, and with particular reference to the development of frailty, which I'll go into in a minute. There's absolutely nothing there. We know so much about type 2 diabetes and frailty, but so little about type 1. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping to address with my project. Obviously, we've come a long way in just over 100 years since the discovery of insulin. And we now got all this technology that we can use. And as a result of that, people with type 1 diabetes are starting to live much longer. And I just quote some figures from the National Diabetes Audit recently, which showed that 15% of people with type 1 diabetes are now over 65, which is 30,000 people. And 2.8% of people are over the age of 80, which is a really large number of people, 7,000 people. So it's important that we do research this. And these numbers are only going to increase as we go forward, because people are living longer. And Diabetes UK are now providing medals for people that live a long time with diabetes. So you can apply for those if you are living over 50 years long. So what is frailty? The medical definition is a physiological decline and loss of reserve across organ systems that leaves an individual vulnerable to stresses which trigger deteriorations in health or functional status, which is a very long sentence. And I kind of like to summarize it as the loss of bounce back ability. So for somebody who suffers from like a cough or a cold with frailty, might be laid low for many weeks with that, whereas a younger person or someone that's not suffering from frailty might recover from it in a matter of days. So very minor ailments become something that becomes very difficult to recover from. And there are lots of different ways that we as clinicians measure frailty. There's like a visual analog scale, we call it the Rockwood score, which often people use in hospital, but it can actually be measured using what we call the Fried Frailty Index, which looks at five domains. And those are involuntary weight loss, grip strength, exhaustion, walking speed, and physical activity. 3 of them are assessed by questionnaires, and the walking speed and grip strength are sort of physical tests that people undergo. And by measuring these 5 things, we can assess somebody's frailty score. And one of the things that, frailty can impact someone's diabetes management hugely. I've just come up with a few things that I'll mention now. So weight loss will affect your insulin sensitivity. You might experience changes in appetite, which of course will affect how much insulin you need. Changes in mood, that's been mentioned already, can affect, again, your glucose control. Dexterity issues such as Parkinson's disease or arthritis as someone gets older might affect someone's ability to use insulin pens or check their own blood glucose levels. People's activity is reduced, and there's lots of medications that people use that might again affect people's glucose control. So essentially what might be happening is that people with type 1 diabetes who start to experience frailty are actually finding that their glucose has suddenly become much more difficult to manage at exactly the time when perhaps they are finding it more difficult to manage for other reasons, such as dexterity. So what do we do at the moment? So most of the things that we do at the moment are completely guided by research that's been conducted in type 2 diabetes, which, although it's great, may not necessarily be applicable to type 1. So that's the one caveat that I'll mention with all of this. And there was a really good meta-analysis that looked at the consequences of hypoglycemia, and that showed that the more hypos that people have, the higher your risk. Well, for older adults, this is looking specifically at older adults, the more hypos that older adults have, the higher their risk of heart attack, stroke, falls and fractures, and actually all-cause mortality as well. So in older adults in general, the principle is to try and relax the glucose control and avoid hypoglycemia and the consequences of that in older adults. And so as people's frailty level progresses, the idea is to try and relax the glucose control slightly more. Added to that is that as people get older, often people's hypoglycemia awareness is reduced. So people might not be so aware of the hypoglycemia, and clinicians might not recognize it so readily as hypos. So it might just be presenting as confusion, falls, or just feeling tired. So the three questions that I wanted to ask as part of my research, if I just skip to that, number one, what is the influence of frailty on the glycemic profile of older adults with type 1 diabetes? Number two, what are the experiences and expectations of older adults with type 1 diabetes and those caring for them towards aging and diabetes self-management? And number three, to establish whether altered glycemic control is associated with the changes in the rate of progression towards frailty over time in older adults with type 1 diabetes. So what I'm planning is to recruit 100 older adults with type 1 diabetes. I say older adults, I don't think many people are particularly in favour of that term, but it's people above the age of 65. So apologies if you're in that age range. We'll do a urine C-peptide to find out whether each individual actually has type 1, to ensure the insulin secretion is low. We'll then do a frailty assessment and divide people into two groups, either as frail or as robust. And then we'll use continuous glucose monitoring in blinded mode to find out what the glucose levels of each group are and compare them against each other to find out whether frailty is having an impact on glycemic control. I then plan to invite a subsection of those people back for an hour-long semi-structured interview to talk about people's experiences of aging and what their expectations are for the future. Just on a note from experience, what I've noticed is that lots of people are perhaps quite fearful of what aging might entail for them with type 1 diabetes. And that's something that really isn't well documented in the literature. And I'll be really interested to find out what people's views are, especially towards the potential idea of having to hand over control to someone else in the setting perhaps of dementia, or where people can't actually manage their insulin themselves. So that I'm going to find that really interesting, I think. And in addition to 20 older adults with type 1 diabetes, also I hope to recruit 10 people who are carers for older adults with type 1 diabetes. And then the last part of the project will be to invite everyone back after 1 year and reassess the frailty status. And again, it's to find out whether glucose control is associated with frailty trajectory, whether people who are having more hypos, for example, progress towards frailty at a faster rate. So all those questions we don't know the answers to, so it'll be really exciting to find out. So far, I've conducted a pilot study that we recruited 20 people to that, and obviously we're only on the first visit for that. And one of the issues that I'm having is that it's actually quite difficult to find people who are living with frailty. So I've come up with a few strategies to try and increase my inclusion of people living with frailty, including potentially the option of doing home visits to visit people at home, to see whether we can really make sure that participation is inclusive, as was talked about right at the start. So I was really interested to hear that chat. I think I've run out of time, but I'm very happy to stay until afterwards, and happy to answer any questions that people might have about the research.
Can I just ask a question, please, Jonathan?
Of course, yeah.
Well, two things. I've tweeted, but anyway, you're saying that you'd use blinded CGM. Is that still sort of applicable, as like 90% of people in the country now use a sensor anyway?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in my pilot study, 14 people out of the 20 were using open CGM. But the thing, I'm not studying CGM per se. I'm studying the impact of frailty on glycemia. So it's really important to have a standardized device for everyone. So whether or not they're using CGM, I want to use my blinded CGM device for my study. That's the reason why I'm going for that.
No, that makes sense. And another thing, have you contacted the medalist group? Because all of those will have had at least 50 years with type 1, and a lot will be older than that. So you might be able to recruit some people there, or they may know of some people.
I have to admit, I've not heard of that group, so I'd be really interested to hear what that group involves, actually. I don't know.
I will tweet you with a couple of the names of the people I know are in it. I'm not at 50 years, but I'm sure they would be really interested to hear from you. But I'll do that. I'll tweet you.
Great. Actually, I think I misheard you. You called it like the medalist group, isn't it? The people that have lived for 50 years with.
Yes.
Yeah, I have been. I haven't been in touch with that group per se, but I have spoken to people who are part of that group. One of the members of my PPI group, I think, is in there. So yeah, okay. I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Jonathan. That was great. So I am now going to introduce the next speaker, and this one is, let me just get it. His name is Dr. Dean Minnock, and Dr. Dean Minnock is the CEO at Innovation Z Limited, and Dean is also a researcher based in Ireland. His research investigates the effects of exercise, which was something Mark was speaking about earlier, of exercise on the metabolism and the molecular regulation of skeletal, I cannot say this word, skeletal muscles. Don't laugh at me, I'm tongue-tied tonight. And his current project involves exercise interventions on glycemic management, which was very much what Mark was talking about earlier, and the skeletal muscular adaptations to reverse or regress diabetic complications in individuals living with type 1 diabetes. So I believe this is a little video that Tom's going to play. Well, a little video chat that Tom's going to play, and I will let you go, Tom.
Thank you so much. So yeah, Dean is currently away working, which he explains in the audio, and it's great that he was able to record his audio sat in the airport today. So I'll hand over to Dean.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dean Minnock, and I'm a researcher in the area of diabetes from Ireland. I'm delighted to be able to join and partake in this call tonight, albeit not live. I'm traveling for work this week, and due to a delayed flight earlier, I was unable to. I will be unable, I guess, in the future to join live. So Tom has been kind enough to allow me to do a pre-recording just on my small section, and share it with you guys. So to kick right off, just provide a little bit of background to myself. I predominantly work in industry right now. I still have some academic research arm that I'm involved in, but what takes up, maybe 90 to 95% of my time is my industry work, where I run a company called Innovation Z. Those of you who are familiar with us, you may be aware we've been making some noise this year, and our primary technology, we are an R&D company, again based in Dublin, and we focus on devices and technology to add on to injection pens, primarily insulin pens, to make all pens smart connected pens. But I'm here tonight to give you a quick discussion and maybe an update from my research life, from my academic life, and maybe give you guys some information on what we've covered over the last couple of years and how it may be useful or at least of interest to you guys on the call. So a bit of background on myself. I have a science degree, a Bachelor of Science in sport and exercise. I did my master's degree in physiology, and then I completed my PhD in 2020 from UCD in Dublin, also in the area of physiology. Myself, I'm not a type 1 diabetic. I'm not a diabetic at all. And it's, I guess, a very long and interesting story how I got into this area. But during the course, certainly of my master's degree, I undertook some research projects looking at metabolic disorders and different areas affecting metabolism. And as part of my master's thesis project, we got paired with a group of type 1 diabetics who were living in Dublin. And these people were looking towards early stage exercise and how it could potentially help improve their outcomes, their current physiological and psychological well-beings. And there was a small group of researchers in Trinity at that time that were looking at this area, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole. I guess the transition into my industry life then started right at the outset of my PhD, where I was introduced to, since my PhD was in UCD, I was introduced to the company Innovation Z, who at that time were also based in UCD. And more and more as I went down through my PhD, I was being exposed more and more to people with diabetes, and in particular type 1. And beyond my research side, what really attracted my attention then to my industry side was that the industry side of Innovation Z, one of the founders, John, was a type 1 and an MDI user himself, that I really got attached to the community quite a bit. I got to know a lot of people very personally, and very, very passionate and lovely bunch of people that we were working with. And from my interest level, I've never been able to shake my desire for research and my passion for the academic route. But truly, I've always wanted to try and practice what I preach. And I was working with these people on a daily basis. I was meeting these people on a daily basis, and I understood that certainly from pen audience, they were severely unmet, certainly 7, 8, 9 years ago, with regards to technology, and if they didn't have access to pumps, it became quite difficult for that audience to get good resource and good support for their insulin data. So I've ended up, I suppose, kind of converting my focus a little bit, and certainly devoting a lot of my efforts and time now toward technologies and supporting MDI users. But to get back to maybe more of a research focus, my PhD maybe, I guess, is what's happened in most recent life and what has dictated mostly my research at the moment, away from my industry work. And what I had started with was, we were looking towards trying to figure out 3 key things. How does type 1 diabetes in particular, or how does diabetes as a whole, impact skeletal muscle health, its function, and really the how and the why behind this. What is really the underlying mechanism of the condition that potentially is impacting the skeletal muscle health and function, and in turn, what is the knock-on effect of that back on the condition? So it is kind of a cyclical cycle, unfortunately. And we done this really by exploring it from a molecular level, changes in gene expression and changes from a molecular level upwards. First off, we really had to figure out if these impacts existed, and a lot of literature at the time, where it is still quite a moderately investigated area and researched area. There was some really good research out there, and it gave us kind of a good basis that did indicate that skeletal muscle was being impacted, and certainly is impacted quite a bit by diabetes. But we really wanted to know if these alterations, what they were, how they're being caused, and why. And then from there, could these alterations be something that are reduced, regressed, or even reversed, mostly through exercise? Could undertaking an exercise lifestyle start to reduce some of the impacts that are being caused by the condition? And I guess the primary focus of all of this work, we had to try and figure out, how can this exercise, if it's effective, be adopted sustained and carried out by people, most importantly looking at how this exercise can be conducted and tailored for getting the kind of results that we would like to see brought around in skeletal muscle health, but most importantly having a safe glycemic response. So without severe hypos or severe hypers, you know, and particularly during nocturnal hours or nighttime. So just looking at a couple of slides here, I know you guys can't see it, but it's quite ironic. 4 years of a PhD seems to be summarized and categorized as 4 key studies, 1 review study, and then 3 human intervention studies. And believe me, it felt like it really feels like a lot more research, really a lot more going on than just 4 studies. So where we started out was a systematic review of the existing literature. So I had conducted a literature review and really started to look at the area as a whole. But when we started to refine this and narrow the scope a little bit, starting off with my systematic review, looking at the different effects of different exercise types, durations, modalities, intensities, and how that really affects and impacts glycemic control. So because we believe, and certainly I believe, that glycemic control, the fear of glycemic fluctuations, the inability to have good control caused by exercise, often led to a reduction in people being very willing to get involved in exercise. We really decided to start there. Could we decide and could we refine, based on existing literature, what type of exercise was going to lead to a very, very safe glycemic response? And thankfully, we were, able to do this. So the key findings from that study was that 2 of the big drivers in glycemic response is the modality, the type of exercise, be it aerobic or anaerobic or a mix of both. And don't worry if you're not very well versed in those terms. Really, is it a long duration or short duration exercise that's maybe more focused on like walking, running, more of an aerobic activity, or maybe more of a body weight or weight training activity that's certainly going to invoke anaerobic kind of a result from a resistance type of training. And what we found was that the modality, yes, that mode was very important, but also the intensity and duration are tremendously important from 2 different factors. The duration, what we had found was the most substantial impact on glycemic control post the exercise itself came when exercise bouts lasted greater than 40 minutes. And we also found that the higher the intensity, the better controlled, the less dramatic fluctuation there seemed to be from a glycemic point of view. And what we had then really found from the literature was that a combined exercise modality, specifically being able to perform more resistance style exercises before an aerobic bout, had the best overall glycemic response. And that was the case for a 24-hour period, which was very, very important, certainly looking at how you may respond to exercise during the nighttime, during nocturnal hours. So what we had found initially was that being able to perform quite an intense duration resistance exercise followed by an aerobic exercise had a very, very strong impact on how easily it was to control it. I really won't go into too much detail now, but I will leave my information available at the end of the call. Please, guys, feel free to reach out to me. Any emails or questions, send me a tweet. You'll catch me on LinkedIn. But if you do want to drop me a message on Twitter, I can give you my email. I'd happily set some calls. I really don't want to go into the actual responses and how. I'm really going to kind of skim through this at a high level. So hopefully that's okay. So then what we decided to do, having done this systematic review, is we wanted to put it into practice. Quite difficult at the time, 2015. Flash CGM devices were quite hard to get hold of, and it was difficult for us to try and figure out how could we do a pretty short duration exercise to look at the effects of the exercise modalities and the 24-hour response from a glycemic point of view. Plus, we wanted to see changes in gene expression or signaling pathways related to muscle metabolism, growth, and inflammation. So we rounded up some very willing participants, and maybe just as a very short comment, if any of you guys are sitting on the fence or thinking about taking part in any sort of academic work or research, please don't hesitate. Any time you can allot, any effort you can allot is vital to building a knowledge base here, and certainly vital in return for most of you on the call to get better informed and get better information and overall outcomes. So we looked at a short duration project where we had a week between each exercise intervention. 1 week was no exercise, a week where it was 40-minute aerobic exercise, a 40-minute resistance exercise, or that 40-minute combined exercise modality. And we wanted to really look at what was this like in glycemic response? Was it going to be safe? And kind of B, what were the effects on the muscle markers, the gene expression and the metabolism that we would want to see to invoke and bring around good changes in skeletal muscle health? Again, we were confirmed in all gene expression from muscle growth to inflammation to metabolism that the combined exercise bout was in fact the best for invoking these type of results, and it was also the safest modality with the fewest numbers of corrections, severe corrections, nocturnal hypoglycemias, etc. Experienced in that modality. So then we decided to put it to the long-term test. We stuck with just this combined method, training 3 times a week for a 12-week period, and we essentially just evaluated pre and post exercise. Did they bring around good findings? And we really made some substantial learnings from the end of that study. We did find that people over this period of time, almost naturally, through regular exercise, had a greater control and level of confidence in their ability to stabilize glycemic control themselves. We found from the muscle biopsies that we had taken that the condition, type 1 diabetes itself, had created severe impairments to mitochondrial function and even reductions in telomere length. But we did find that being able to partake in the physical activity significantly counteracted those, so much so to the point that people who had gotten to the end of the 12 weeks and been able to fulfill most of the exercise requirements, that these impairments that were being created had been reduced and significantly regressed, almost to the point where they were displaying the same symptoms as their non-diabetic counterparts who took part in the study. But we had made one key observation, which that people with type 1 diabetes had seemed to have perceived or levels of fatigue much greater than those who were non-diabetic in the studies. And that led me into my final study, which was an EMG study, where we were looking at the neuromuscular function. We kind of stepped away from the molecular side, but we looked at the neuromuscular function between the groups of type 1 and non-diabetic. And really what we had looked at here was, if this kind of trend that we had seen from the previous study was true, were these people coming in with higher levels of fatigue, and was that attributed to the condition itself? And really the findings were there that we didn't find that the neuromuscular profile, so the condition was having no real effect on the neuromuscular profile, and we couldn't confirm that there was clear motor unit degradation caused by the condition. But we did find that the type 1 group compared to the non-diabetic group had better strength output from a neuromuscular perspective, but longer times for recovery. So there was an underlying fatigue issue there. And this is where I guess I left off with my PhD. And this is an area that we're now continuing in. And this area in particular is of interest to us now for 2 reasons. One, we want to fulfill the knowledge gap, and we're working with and collaborating with some great researchers at the moment, and some researchers in the area that I was going to give a quick shout out to. Richard Bracken from Swansea is incredible. Thomas Hawke from McMaster University in Canada, Michael Riddle, and Jane Yardley from the University of Alberta, also in Canada, are just to name a few, are some incredible researchers in the area, who I would say, if you guys have got some interest in certainly exercise and the outcomes of exercising, particularly with type 1 diabetes, these are researchers I would highly recommend to follow. So from my perspective, I'm going to wrap up here. We are continuing and expanding this research into neuromuscular differences from the condition and maybe problems that are caused on the neuromuscular level right now through some collaborations with those researchers just mentioned, and my former PhD supervisor, Giuseppe De Vito, the University of Padua in Italy. So we are trying to move that along. And from an industry side, we also have an interesting tie-in to this type of data to see is there a clear comparison to glycemic levels, and we're hoping that that could potentially fuel some development into our next technology as well. So I'm going to wrap it there. Apologies that I've gone on a little bit longer, and I'm very sorry, guys, that I couldn't join in person. I will share some links and material that may be useful for you guys if you wish to follow up on some readings, but please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm more than happy to allot some time and answer some questions. Thanks very much again to Tom and all the work that's going on for the guys with this community and this chat. I think it's an excellent resource, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for that. Really appreciate you coming on as a speaker and preparing the audio file in the airport today. And if anyone has any questions for Dean, like the other guys tonight, Diana, Hilary, Jonathan, Jacq, who'll be soon, and Jasmine, you can tweet #DiabetesChat or request a microphone and come say hi. From about 10 o'clock, we'll have a little Q&A, hopefully. So heading back to Tony for our next speaker.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Hope everyone's enjoying the huge variety of speakers we've had so far. We've explored a length and breadth of knowledge and experience, but we're not stopping just yet. Still got another couple of speakers. We'll jump right into our next one. So we've got Jacq Allan up next. Jacq is a trainee clinical and academic psychologist who founded and ran the charity Diabetics with Eating Disorders and has lived with type 1 herself since 2003. Our current research focuses on how psychometrics designed for the general population to measure eating disorders don't actually work for the type 1 population. So Jacq, take it away.
Hi there, hope everyone can hear me okay. Can someone just I don't know how to do that thumbs up-y thing. Yeah.
You sound great.
Perfect, thanks everyone. So yeah, hi everyone. Just to start off, who am I? And I know that Hilary brought up Shan Howarth earlier, and I think it's probably important for me to say that Shan Howarth actually helped me run DWED from nearly its conception to the time of her death. So yeah, just because she came up. If you're interested in knowing any more about Shan, if you go onto the DWED website, there's an in memoriam section which is dedicated to her. So when I was running DWED, I realised that as much as the charity was doing everything that it could, the research base, the literature for what we were saying wasn't there. So at that point, I decided to go back and do an undergraduate in psychology, which eventually led me to do my PhD and then to go on and do another doctorate, which is a doctorate in clinical psychology. So hence the trainee clinical, but doctor academic. So my username, that's the doctor, not doctor yet. So what I did for my PhD, and this is, I need to sort of explain this to explain why I did the most recent research. I was looking at the whole spectrum really of eating disorders and type 1 diabetes and looking at the research canon, because I could see from the community and from all of our sort of shared experiences that this was not being reflected in the research literature. So I set out to prove that in my PhD, really. And the first thing that I did was a systematic review, looking at every single psychometric that's ever been used to measure eating disorders in type 1 diabetes. And surprise, surprise, I found that most of them just were not really applicable. So they very often missed out unique features of type 1 diabetes eating disorders. TIDE, as I called them back then, T1ED, there was very little, if anything, about insulin emission. But there were still a lot of questions that could be confusing to people with type 1 diabetes, such as, do you ever find yourself out of control with food? So the systematic review that I did found that basically all the instruments that we have are pretty crap, including the ones that are diabetes specific. What's really scary is the ones that are diabetes specific have had actual very little input from people living with type 1 diabetes, and there was nothing about people who were living with type 1 diabetes and an eating disorder. So to sort of prove that these psychometrics were not fit for purpose, I ran EAT26. I mean, they all have completely ridiculous names, but that's also another story. I ran the EAT26 on a large-scale sample of people with type 1 diabetes, over 700, and 85% of them screened positive for eating disorders, whereas only 30 to 40% actually identified as having one. I then, at that point, actually asked people with type 1 diabetes what they thought contributed to their eating disorders. And the two largest factors in that, surprise, surprise, were diabetes specific. So out of this, I then built a structural model and found that diabetes specific distress independently predicted eating disorder symptomology and higher HbA1c, which put together could be assumed to be something that may look like diabulimia. I also, looking through the literature, I did a systematic review on the amount of treatment programs that had been offered, and circa 2019, realised that only in the research literature only reported the treatment of under 200 people over 20 years. And that made me very angry, because in the research literature, people were often talking about how difficult people with type 1 are to treat. But these assumptions were based on under 200 subjects, which felt pretty ridiculous. So I built an intervention and I ran it online over 6 months, pulling in every favour that I sort of was owed by some lovely healthcare professionals who had worked with DWED and were sort of trusted by everyone at DWED and everyone in the community, and managed to reduce HbA1c into nice recommended levels over the space of those 6 months. Everyone also improved in measures of self-efficacy, in measures of diabetes distress and eating disorder symptomology. Previous to this, the idea was that you can't treat people with type 1 diabetes and eating disorders in anything other than a massively expensive, resource-intensive inpatient program. And of course, my contention was that the reason that the interventions aren't working isn't because they were difficult to treat, it's because we're being treated for something that we don't have. And yes, that's exactly what was happening. So people were sort of sitting around scratching their heads, wondering, why is this standard anorexia protocol not working for people with type 1 diabetes? Bearing in mind that standard anorexia protocol is stop thinking about what you eat so much. So all of that research led me on to, when I started training in clinical psychology, I had to do another research project. And at that point, I thought, well, what I really wanted to do was design a brand new metric for people with type 1 diabetes, where they told people with lived experience of eating disorders and type 1 diabetes, and they could tell me how they felt that questionnaire should be structured. However, I wasn't able to do that at the time. And so I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll take the eating disorder examination questionnaire, which is the most commonly used at that point. So this is a scale by Fairbairn and Belgin from 1994. It's a sort of gold standard of eating disorder screeners. I thought, okay, what I can do is I can get people with lived experience to tell me how I should modify this questionnaire and therefore make it appropriate for use among people who have type 1 diabetes. But of course, in doing that, I broke my number one rule, which is to never put anything with diabetes and equate it to anything in the general population. But by this point, my time was running out. We were in the middle of COVID. And so I went off and I employed people with lived experience of type 1 diabetes and an eating disorder, hopefully some of who are listening just now. And if so, thank you so much for taking part in it, to see if we could modify the eating disorder examination questionnaire. And what we found was that, yes, the questionnaire could be modified. However, I'd fallen down another hole, I think, which is that the people who helped me modify this questionnaire all had a significant lived experience of diabulimia. And so the questionnaire that came out of that was very indicative of diabulimia, but not really indicative of other eating disorders and type 1 diabetes. So the end of my research is good and bad news. Yes, we can have a diabulimia screener, but actually that's not enough. And especially as one of the main research findings were that when I asked people with type 1 diabetes to define how their experience with eating disorders, the amount of people who said binge eating disorder had gone up something like 3 or 4 times since my last research, and the amount of people saying diabulimia had decreased by around about the same amount. Also, there are people who had described themselves as TIDES, T1DE, which is the nomenclature that came out of the King's Clinic. What I think that this is suggestive of, though, and the only thing really I can put it down to, is that there is some interaction now between how we are interacting with the technology that we're using, with the sort of feedback loop of constant numbers, and how that's affecting our eating patterns. And I think the main issue is that we are absolutely not caught up. We are still using questionnaires that were fit for purpose in 2005, but aren't taking, and I'm not talking about in eating disorders, I'm talking about in other areas of diabetes, but that aren't looking at the interaction between our psychology and our diabetes technology and all of the other sort of things that are intersectional when it comes to how we're able to manage our diabetes treatment successfully. Another thing to mention is that I really wanted my project to be relevant and representative of men with type 1 diabetes, and I just couldn't get the amount of participants needed to make those assumptions. So another recommendation of the research that I've done is that we need to be looking at this as a matter of urgency now. My feeling is that we're at the point now where we need a codified diagnostic. We need something in the DSM or something in the ICD that means that we can actually define what is normal eating distress, what is type 1 diabetes eating distress, and what is the side of the tightrope that pushes us into a clinically significant eating disorder. And I just don't think that research has been done anywhere, including my own. I think my research is very relevant for people who have diabulimia. But one of the things that came out of the research when I asked people, I went through every single question and said, do you think that this could be indicative of an eating disorder or just type 1 diabetes management? And this led to a whole subscale having to be removed, which was called eating distress, because the people living with type 1 diabetes said all of these questions could also just be indicative of the day-to-day management of type 1 diabetes. So my feeling is that what we really need to do is some sort of large-scale study, something like a Delphi study, where we're going back to the community, where we're doing ground roots, and we're actually able to disseminate what is clinically significant and what is not. But I'm not sure how we do that. I kind of feel that people are more aware of diabulimia now, which is great, but it's at a time where there's a whole host of problems coming up behind that we have no idea really of how to deal with. And like I said, I think it's because we are not caught up with the technology. We're not caught up with the intersections. But I am thinking about going and doing some sort of clinical fellowship looking at that. Who knows? I'm off to join the paediatric diabetes unit as their clinical psychologist. I'm really excited about that, and hopefully that will give me some more ideas for the future. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing all of that. That was really interesting. And if anyone's got any questions about anything that Jacq or any of the other speakers we've had so far and they would like to ask, you can put that into the hashtag as well.
And I think it was a very interesting piece of research, Jacq, and I know Kez is something that she's really passionate about as well. And I know you guys are working on doing a diabetes chat with yourself in a few weeks' time, I believe. So we can follow on from this as well. It'd be great learning about you and more about the research and yeah, I really look forward to that. Next, our guest speaker is Jasmine. We have sent you a request, Jasmine, to join the speaker panel. I've sent you a few messages, so is Gary and Tony, I believe. So just hoping that you've seen that and you can accept the request and jump on the panel. Hopefully you've seen our messages. But so far it's been a really interesting diabetes chat with our research event. Kez, was there anything you wanted to mention there? Because I know that's a very important topic for you. Is there anything you wanted to mention while we hopefully bring up our next speaker?
I don't know really, without giving away a lot of the stuff that I want to talk about in the near future, I suppose. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, certainly as someone who, well, I'd almost say 100% wouldn't necessarily identify with diabulimia, but more with the kind of restriction and binging side of things. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And actually, when I was looking for research into the area myself, like there wasn't an awful lot out there. I didn't really know where to go for help. I think that was the biggest thing, really.
Hi, can I ask Jackie a question? I can see you're still there, Jacq. You said in your you said in your talk that when people filled out your survey, there was quite a proportion that didn't identify as having an eating disorder, but the survey indicated they did have one. Did you feed back to those people?
No, because the whole point of it, I don't think I've explained it very well. Sorry, hon.
No,
So-
that's fine.
So I'll give you an example, right? The EAT 26, that was the one that I used originally, and then I did the EDEQ. But the EAT 26 asked questions like, are you ever out of control of your eating? Do you ever feel that you've eaten more than you should? Like all of these questions that could be indicative of type 1 diabetes.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the reason, like 86% of people who filled out my questionnaire, I have no doubt did not have an eating disorder.
Sorry, it was me misunderstanding you then, Jacq. I was just intrigued by that because, to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if a lot more of us did. Well, we have got disordered eating, but whether it's an eating disorder, I wouldn't know. But no, I was just interested. Thanks a lot, and lovely to speak to you and hear your voice. I haven't spoken.
No, I've been a bit absent since I've been back-to-back doctorates. Definitely do not recommend. But yeah, no, like honestly, if you could see these questions, some of them they were like so obvious, like like they were so close to what it looks like to have a hypo binge, and that's what came out of then the later research as well, was that actually virtually none of the questions were suitable because they couldn't delineate what was an eating disorder and what was type 1 diabetes. So like, and even to the extent that in the EDEQ, there was questions like, would you be comfortable with someone seeing you naked? Now, that question is very different depending on whether or not you wear a pump, how you feel about wearing wearable technology and that being seen. So is that indicative of problems with diabetes and diabetes technology, or is that body dysmorphia, or is it an eating disorder? The thing is that those screeners, they don't ask that. And very often you then get denied access to a service, or you get treated for something that you don't have because they go, oh, look, you're screening really high in eating restraint because you've said that you drink diet drinks.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean that's the level of these questionnaires and these screeners. And so no, I didn't feed back to them because I didn't think it would have been appropriate, because I didn't think it was ethical to tell someone who probably doesn't have an eating disorder that they do.
No, I misunderstood then. It was me, Jacq. It wasn't you. I just misunderstood that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I know what you mean, because it's a bit like asking questions about, I don't know how I'd phrase it, but do you not eat stuff that you'd want to eat or whatever? Well,
That's exactly a question.
Yeah,
That is exactly a question in the EDEQ. Do you ever avoid foods that you really like?
yeah, because there's a difference between I avoid it, which I never avoid it because I'm unhealthy, but and whether I'm avoiding it because I don't want the chaos of the blood sugars afterwards. So yeah,
That's exactly it. So then imagine that those questionnaires also have nothing about insulin emission, and these are the ones that are being used in people who have type 1 diabetes.
Yeah. Yeah, oh no, that's really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys, for that little mini Q&A, and we'll continue that shortly when we have our panel discussion. And anyone else that wants to come join, #DiabetesChat, or you can request a mic. We're going to hand over to our final guest speaker of the evening, Jasmine. Jasmine is a PhD student at Deakin University and the University of Copenhagen. She is researching people's experience using open source automated insulin delivery systems, aka looping or do-it-yourself apps. And Jasmine is a member of the Open Project and is passionate about the potential for diabetes technology to improve quality of life. So our final research guest speaker tonight is Jasmine. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. Can you all hear me okay?
All good. And thank you for joining all the way over in Australia.
Yeah, bright and early here. Yeah, so I'll just get cracking. My research focuses on people, like Tom said, who've built their own looping devices, and I focus on the psychological aspects of this. So I thought I'd start with how I got into this space. So in 2018, I got a job at the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, the ACBRD, and this is the first national research centre dedicated to investigating the behavioural, psychological, and social aspects of living with diabetes. And at the ACBRD, I get to work with experts in this space, including Jane Spate, Crystal Hendricks, and Timothy Skinner, who are all supervisors on my PhD. So when I started working at the ACBRD, I started to get an understanding of the negative impacts that diabetes could have on people's mental health and quality of life. And at the time, we shared an office with Renza, who some of you might know. She writes the blog Diabetogenic, and she was blogging about looping. So I think probably some of you probably know what this means, or you may be looping yourselves, but for those who don't, I'll just quickly explain it. So people with diabetes combined existing diabetes technology with new software to create what we call looping, or an open source automated insulin delivery system. And this technology allows continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps to talk to each other, and it automates insulin delivery using an algorithm. And this means that people don't need to do as many calculations, which can lessen the burden of diabetes. And the instructions to build an open source aid system are available online for free. So Renza's blog was the first time that I'd heard about this. She just started looping, and as a result, she was talking about how much easier it was now to manage her diabetes. Her glucose levels were in a safer range, she was sleeping better, and she was worrying about her diabetes less. I was really excited to read Renza's blog and see how much it had changed her life in positive ways. For example, she said, "Without a doubt, this technology has revolutionized every aspect of my diabetes, from the way I sleep, eat, and live." But she'd also shared her struggles of looping, such as technical issues of being met with negative attitudes from healthcare professionals who thought that what she was doing was irresponsible. So it was clear that there were both benefits and challenges to looping. And I wanted to find out more, as I believe there's a lot we could learn from this. It could teach us what was currently missing from diabetes tech, and what medical companies and healthcare professionals could be doing to better support and learn from people with type 1 diabetes. So at the end of 2018, I had the opportunity to apply for a joint PhD with Deakin and the University of Copenhagen. And this PhD was going to focus on people's experiences of looping, and Renza was on the interview panel as one of my potential supervisors. So I was accepted into that PhD program, and I've spent the last 4 years researching people's perspectives and experiences of using this tech. And as part of these studies, I spent 6 months in Denmark recently with my supervisor, Henrietta Langstrup, who works in digital health research. So this PhD consisted of 2 studies, an interview study and an international online survey. So the first study we did was an interview study among Australian adults who were looping. We wanted to ask people about their experiences in their own words, and these interviews were done in 2018 and 2019. So in our first paper, we really wanted to understand more about the benefits and the challenges of looping. So in terms of the benefits, people said that compared to their previous diabetes management, they were sleeping better, they had more stable glucose levels, and they didn't have to think about their diabetes much. They also found it much easier than before to keep their glucose levels within a safe range. And they stated that it was a lot less work for far better outcomes. However, they also described multiple challenges, such as technical issues, being worried about the risks about unregulated technology, and their healthcare professionals not understanding what they were doing. And they used 4 key strategies to deal with these challenges. Firstly, peer support was available online 24/7, and people mainly accessed these via Facebook groups. And some participants described their peers as being more knowledgeable about health than health professionals when it came to things around type 1 diabetes and looping. The second strategy was self-sufficiency. Participants had to build their system and troubleshoot issues without the help of their doctors. And they had some mixed feelings here about feeling both more empowered but also more burdened by this additional responsibility. The third strategy was risk management. While people were aware of the potential risk associated with unregulated technology, they did not believe what they were doing was any riskier than previous management. So Dana Lewis, who's one of the inventors of OpenOPS, makes a really good point that we often underestimate just how risky diabetes without looping is. So you can make a mistake when you're dosing yourself with an insulin pen, for example. But people also carried backup devices in case anything went wrong. And some participants didn't perceive it as a risk to use a system developed by people with diabetes rather than by a medical company. And in fact, some believed it was advantageous as the developers had built it for themselves, and they were therefore motivated to ensure their own safety or the safety of their children, because some of the developers built this for their own children. And then finally, there were some challenges participants couldn't resolve, but they felt that the benefits outweighed these challenges. For example, although there were financial costs associated with running one of these systems, they felt that this was worth it for the health and quality of life benefits they experienced. As a result, they were more hopeful about their future of diabetes, and they expected to live longer and have a decreased risk of diabetes-related complications. Overall, participants reported that the rewards outweigh the cons, and it was all worthwhile. So that was the first paper that we published from the interviews. And that focused on how people were dealing with navigating the challenges of looping. And the next paper that we published from the interviews focused on the future of looping. So it's been suggested that the increase of commercially available hybrid closed loop devices may decrease the uptake of open source systems. With the proliferation of commercial devices entering the market, what will happen to people's involvement in the open source community? So although several commentaries and opinion pieces had hypothesized on this future, at the time, there'd been no research that was actually examining the community's perspective on this question. So we wanted to explore these people's perspectives. And the results of our studies showed that participants agreed that commercial devices would become much more common in the future. And they hoped that this would provide more choices for people of type 1. However, they also believe for these systems to become mainstream, there need to be faster regulatory approvals and funding for diabetes technology in Australia where this was conducted. And I think this is a really important point to acknowledge. People can only uptake the latest technology if it's available and affordable. We also asked participants if they'd ever switch to a commercial system. Participants believed that open source systems were more advanced than the currently available commercial options, which they described as suboptimal. And they expressed diverse views on using commercial systems in the future. Some participants indicated they'd never swap to a commercial device because open source is really working for them. They always thought it was going to be better. Whereas others suggested that they would transition to a commercial system in the future if it was an improvement on how they were currently managing their diabetes, or if it was under warranty and easier to use. But at present, and for the foreseeable future, the majority of participants perceived that open source systems were their best option. And they shared their perspectives on several features that they felt were unique to open source that gave them an advantage. So these were the compatibility, user-led design, customizability, the ability to evolve faster, and the community-driven aspects of open source systems. Participants appreciated that their systems were interoperable, so they could choose the insulin pump and the CGM that suited them best. They also appreciated that this technology was built by and for the diabetes community. And participants hoped that commercial companies could collaborate and learn from people in the open source community. The third feature was customizability. Participants were able to individualize their glucose targets, alarms, and apply settings for various circumstances such as exercise. And the lack of customizability in the commercially available devices in 2019 was often cited as a major disadvantage. So at the time, people couldn't adjust their glucose level targets in these commercial devices. The fourth feature was the ability to evolve faster than commercial products. And this is in part not due to not needing to wait for regulatory approval. Participants felt that commercial devices were primitive compared to open source systems, and they could not catch up to the fast pace at which open source solutions were able to change and evolve. However, participants described that this enabled the open source community to play an important role in pushing for change to happen at a faster rate and driving commercial companies to provide better solutions. Finally, apart from the tangible benefits of the commercial systems, participants also appreciated being part of a peer support-driven community. Overall, participants believe that there was still a place for the open source aid community in the future of diabetes management, and they hope that it would grow in acceptance and popularity in the future. So in this paper, we found that although participants believe that commercial devices would become more commonplace, they still perceived a future for open source systems. They perceived open source systems to have 5 key features that offer them more choice, ownership, and real-time support than was currently possible with commercial devices. And participants indicated by working with, listening to, and learning from people with diabetes, commercial companies are more likely to develop products that better meet their needs. And the final study conducted in my PhD was a cross-sectional survey. This was informed by what we'd learned in the interviews about the benefits that people experienced. So in the interviews, people had described the positive impacts of looping in their own words. And in this study, we wanted to use questionnaires to try and measure those impacts. So this study was conducted in collaboration with the Open Project, and they're an international consortium of researchers who are investigating open source systems. So we conducted an internationally available online survey and collected questionnaire data from 450 people who were looping and compared them to those who weren't. And the questionnaires we selected were based on what we learned from the interviews, from past research, and from the personal experiences of the Open team, as many of them have type 1 diabetes and are looping themselves. So we chose 8 questionnaires that assessed a range of psychosocial areas, lots of stuff. So this is general emotional well-being, sleep quality, quality of life, diabetes-specific positive well-being, diabetes treatment satisfaction, diabetes distress, fear of hypos, and the impact of the pandemic on your quality of life, because this was conducted over 2020. So for all 8 questionnaires, we found in this study that there were significant differences between the groups. And this remained even when we controlled for things like ethnicity, income, things like that. So this indicates that participants who are using these open source systems reported doing better on a range of psychosocial impacts compared to the controls. For example, they reported sleeping better, having a better quality of life, and not worrying as much about hypos or complications. So this study is currently under peer review at a journal. So it hasn't been published yet, but it'll hopefully be coming out soon. I'd like to finish up by just summarizing the main findings from my thesis. So in the interview study, participants who use open source systems reported that they experienced several challenges, but they were navigating these challenges with multiple strategies. They experienced several benefits to their physical health and their quality of life that allowed them to persevere despite the challenges. And they believe that this user-driven approach to the innovation of technology was here to stay, as open source systems have unique features not offered by commercial technology, and because future systems will be able to stay one step ahead by building on what's currently available. Insights from this interview study were used to select 8 psychosocial questionnaires in the online survey, and adults with type 1 diabetes who are using open source systems reported significantly better psychosocial outcomes in all questionnaires than those not using the systems. So it's been an absolute pleasure working on this research, especially getting to work with such a brilliant team across the world. I'd like to thank my co-authors for their work on both of these studies, and I'd also like to thank the people with diabetes who volunteer their time and insights to these studies. Without them, this research could not be possible. And I'd like to thank you all very much for your time and attention today.
Wow, thank you so much, Jasmine, for presenting your diabetes research here on the Diabetes Chat tonight. Can I just thank all our amazing researchers for their time this evening on coming on Diabetes Chat and sharing their fantastic research with us. We've had 6 amazing researchers who are doing such an amazing job in helping research for diabetes. Diana, Hilary, Jonathan, Dean, Jacq, and Jasmine, thank you so much for your time tonight. We've covered so many things tonight, looking at screening, preventing, exercise interventions on glycemia management, technology, eating disorders, lupin, quality of life, looking at diabetes in elderly and fertility, so many topics, and I've probably missed a lot as well. But honestly, thank you so much for your time in the Diabetes Chat research event tonight. So thank you so much, guys. Wow, I think that was just absolutely fantastic. That will be available on our website as a podcast episode. Just 2 hours of just fantastic, amazing research from 6 amazing people. So we are in our open forum Q&A section. If anyone has any questions for our researchers, I can see Jasmine's there, I can see Jacq's there, I can see Jonathan's there, Diana's there. If you have any questions or comments that you want to share for the next 10 minutes or so, please, you can request a microphone. You can hashtag Diabetes Chat and come and ask the questions, or just tweet in the next couple of days. If you have any questions, please tweet the guys. I'm sure they will be very open to answering any questions that you have about their research. Gary, I'm gonna is Gary there?
I'm still here.
Right, Gary, I'm going to throw over to you, and because I know you've got a few questions, some general ones. Did you want to just throw one general question to our guys, and then if anyone has any specific questions to the research that the guys have presented tonight, please, you can hashtag or request a mic. But have you got a question that you want to ask the guys?
Yes. So my question, I think a lot of you have answered round about it, but for the community to know. So my question is, why did you decide to enter into diabetes research? So what I'm trying to find out is do you have a link to diabetes? Is it through yourself? Is it through family members? Is it through friends? Or is it just a sheer passion you had for people living with diabetes? So that's my question.
I could talk to that a little bit first, and then maybe Jacq next, because she just saw that they are unmuted. So for me, growing up, my grandfather had type 2 diabetes, and I definitely had, friends in high school and uni with type 1, so I was a little bit aware of it. But I'd always been interested in health and psychology and the impacts that physical health can have on mental health. So I previously done work in epilepsy that was very similar. And other things like neuropsychology. So it was a similar sort of topic for me, as well as having that experience of my friends around me. Maybe Jacq next.
Yeah, I think for me, it was. Well, I'm going to be honest. I was just really angry. I was living in a community of people who were all saying exactly the same thing, and this was completely and utterly contradicted by the published research. And as I think something that annoyed me even more was that most of it just seemed like common sense. And that's what led me into my research. I would never just say that I'm like research is my entire job. Like, I'm always going to do research, I'm always going to do my clinical work, and I'm in the stages of setting up a new charity to actually try and pay people with type 1 diabetes to get involved with research, or to get involved with NHS policy, or to go to nice committees and stuff like that, as very often I sort of feel like it's the quote unquote usual suspects who then end up sort of driving a lot of this stuff. And it's really important to I count myself among that, especially when I was running the charity. So yeah, I guess a mixture of passion and rage is what keeps my research fueled.
And I think that's amazing to hear that both of you have got very similar situations. You have grown up round about it, or you live with diabetes. But I think, Jacq, what you've just said there is yours is more, your passion was ignited because of a lack of research as well into specific factors of diabetes, looking into eating disorders. And I think that I was part of your research and did do the questionnaire and things that you done. So for me, it is something that's important, because throughout a whole patch of my teenage years, from about the age of 14 up to 25, I just stopped doing diabetes in terms of wanted to be perfectly thin and wanted to look what I would deem picture perfect, and was reducing insulin amounts or just skipping JAGs completely to get the benefit that I wanted without thinking of the consequences later on in life. So I think that's fantastic. Now, we did get a question through from Mary, and it is actually a fantastic question. So Mary, who is part of JDRF, has asked, how do you see the field of diabetes research evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? And what do you think will be the most important areas of focus over this span of time?
I mean, I can take that from a psychology perspective.
Yeah.
I think in terms of psychology, oh gosh, it's hard to know. Where I would like to see the field develop, I think, is around quality of life. I know there's been a bit of chat about that today, but around quality of life, and also around how technology is affecting how we interact psychologically with our sense of self. I think that there needs to, like I sort of said in my talk, I think that there's now a gap, a significant gap, temporal gap, between how we are measuring things like psychological well-being and what the effect of technology of that is. And it's great to see people here that are really doing that research and kind of on the cutting edge of it. But there are no models. There's no psychological models around this. You know, like we're only just getting up to like modifying CBT for eating disorders, or like looking at psychodynamic therapy in type 1 and eating disorders. And that to me is great that it's all going on now, but I reckon we're about 5 psychologists, clinical psychologists at least. I reckon we're behind in terms of models of how diabetes and psychology interact. So that's where I would like to see it over the next 5-10 years.
That's fantastic to hear, Jacq, and I hope that is the way it goes, because I do think quality of living is such a huge factor now. And I know, Jacq, you're kind of from Scotland area, or based in around about it, or used to be. And I know that in Scotland we are very focused just now on quality of living, and they are handing out, not for every area, but some health boards are handing out things like hybrid closed loops a little bit easier for quality of living factors of life. But nobody actually thinks about the quality of living when you're attached to tech 24/7 and there is no breaks. And I think that's an area that is a bit iffy just now. And I'd love to see some research into that. And if anybody wants to do it, I'd happily read it with them and support them along with it. Now, Diane, I can see you have got your hand up, and we would love to hear your insight into this as well.
Well, we're talking about the future. I guess I have to say something about the future, right? Since I do predictive analytics. But what I'm going to see in the future is more and more push for a digital twin. So what I want to see in the future is being able to characterize a person, the whole person, behavior, genetics, wearables, physiology, all together, and be able to use the entire data about this person to create a solution before even the problem happened. We were successful to do that with two models. One is called DK model that predicts diabetes ketoacidosis, and another one predicts the resin A1C. Both models have been used in clinic real time to predict those, and we were able to implement intervention at point of care immediately in clinic, and we were able to reduce risk of 58%. So what I want to see in the future is that effort to get taken worldwide and be serving people everywhere, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, in Africa, and everywhere is needed, because I believe that we have to provide equity in care, and we need to improve access to care, and I see that technology can do that. We just need to be smart, and we need to work together, because excellence is in a multidisciplinarity, and we have to do exactly that. We have to work together, specialists and people that are a bit more like me. I'm a generalist, and we have to really push together and keep the mind on the point. And the point is, we need to create a better world.
Diane, I just want to say that was a fantastic response to that question, as was Jack's. Both responses were phenomenal. And I agree with you on this, Diane, in terms of equity needs to be had for everyone. We can't have countries that are in like Southeast Asia and Asian countries and places like Africa and South Africa where access to life-saving medical care is limited, and at best, I say limited at best because sometimes it's just non-existent. And I think that it's about inclusion, getting everybody involved, shaking up the way we look at diabetes care throughout the whole globe, not just in specific areas. So throughout the whole globe, and that is something that is I would like to see happen, as well as bringing in equity for everybody so that it's a level playing field and everybody has access to life-saving equipment and drugs that are required. And that's not just for diabetes, that is for every health condition. We have to have medical care provided. It's a basic human right, and
especially when you see evidence of these amazing research that has proven how all this amazing technology and things is helping people. So hopefully, as we progress in the next 5-10 years, answering that question is hopefully that it's widely more accessible for everyone. I want to bring in Jonathan. What's your viewpoint on this?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me in. It's a really great question as to where diabetes research needs to go, and I kind of think it really needs to be directed by the people living with the condition. So I'd really love to hear what people think, but I think from my perspective, I think it's all about the technology, and my own point of view, looking at how the technology can help with older adults as well, would be really interesting to find out how people are willing to embrace it and how far they're willing to go with that.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And Jasmine, did you want to add on to that for this final part of the question?
I think that's a really brilliant stuff about technology and access discussed there, and that's really important to see. I'm going to go in a different direction. When I'm thinking about the future of diabetes research, I'd really love to see more work done in women's health. We've had some great diabetes chats recently about menopause, and I think there's also some really interesting work to be done around menstrual cycles, and I think that's a really under-researched area that I hope will be getting attention in the future. And the ACPRD did some research a while back asking the community about what research they wanted to happen, and that will be informing the next few years of the ACPRD's work. And I hope that they'll be releasing that report soon, so we'll be able to share that too with you too about what people in Australia want us to be working on.
Absolutely, that's really exciting, and I think that echoes what Jonathan says. I think it should be steered by us people, I guess, who are living with diabetes, and that's where we have the amazing people like you guys who can support us, and it's just a circle relationship, isn't it? We're in this together, and we appreciate you guys like with everything you're doing. Diana, I saw your hand there. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about more woman-based work. I give you a story. When I was at Children's Mercy, a little girl reached out to me and asked me if I can do a study because she was having her period that was very dramatic, and her insulins were all over the place. Her dosage was all over the place, and medical people seems to have difficulties to understand why she would get so sick every time that she had their period, basically. And I was really struggling as researcher to find a way to fund this type of research, because a lot of agency answer to my request of funding was that research on women is only 50% of the population, so the impact is not enough to justify funding. And so I just want to say that we also need to find a way to invest in this kind of research, because right now as researcher we get very much little support on investing on research dedicated to women health. And I think that this is a problem. As a woman and a researcher, I realize that we have not enough women in research actually, especially in data science and in tech, to support these kind of studies. And we don't have enough funding to actually approach these as should be approached, by dedicating data collection on apps that can help us to, for example, describe hyper during periods in a population that may be still growing, because I'm talking about pediatrics. So these girls can be 10, 11, 12, but we know that the age affects a ton the way how the period develop, and they might have hard time later on in life. So how we do that? We do that by advocating. So guys, your patient, advocate for us, advocate for the JDRF, LMC, all this big foundation to provide support also for those projects that might be not so inclusive, because we're talking about only women, but it should be done. Same things for transgender kids. We need funding for transgender kids research and those minorities that right now just don't have enough attentions.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that. So, guys, anyone on the panel have any questions for our amazing researchers? Jasmine, Jacq, Jonathan, and Diana is there. Or anyone who wants to tweet hashtag DiabetesChat before we conclude tonight's amazing Diabetes Chat research event. It's just been tremendous hearing from all our researchers. Mark, Flipper, Claire, Tony, Kez, Gary, any sort of final questions that you wanted to ask? I know there's a few on Twitter that you can go and check out as well. But is anyone on the panel that wants to pose the final questions? Everyone's happy, right?
There is one more question I would like to ask Tom. I was just
Gary.
holding off in case anybody else wanted. So there is quite a lot of discussion, specifically between myself, Kez, and some other people that are asking what sort of advice would you give to someone that wants to go into research but doesn't know how to get into it, doesn't know the approaches to take? So for Kez and myself, we are both very passionate about things and we would like to do something like research, but what advice would you give to us if we wanted to try and pursue some research into diabetes or any form of research? Jacq, on you go.
Yeah, I think that this is actually like a genuine issue, and it's something that I repeatedly come across. Is like people that just don't know where to get started. And maybe we could have some larger conversations about this organization that I'm trying to set up, because I don't see me as being the head of it once it's set up, but because obviously I've done something similar in the past, I think probably a good place to start. Unfortunately, the answer is you have to do a lot. I think you have to do a lot of networking. And this is part of the problem, because once you get through the door on that, like especially I did a lot of stuff, for example, with NHS England, but that made me one of the usual suspects, and it elevated my voice louder than I think a lot of the other diabetes community. And I think that there needs to be far more equity in how we as a patient group as a whole go about involving ourselves in research, but also being involved at the conception. Because I wrote a tweet not too long ago about how if I could have a job where I just went around saying about research papers that they were irrelevant because at no point was anyone with the condition, in our case type 1 diabetes, involved. And it's always those research papers that get published that then you're like, these results don't make any sense. And you look back and you go, oh yeah, they haven't consulted anyone with type 1. And so I guess the larger answer to this is like, get involved with type 1 diabetes, get type 1 with Diabetes UK, and get involved with JDRF. But I think that you can sort of start feeling like a small voice in that. But I think that the answer is like some sort of new organisation that is focused on this. And that's something that I'm hoping to start driving forward in the next 6 months.
Thanks very much for that answer, Jacq. Belinda, I see you've come up. Is there anything you would like to discuss with us or answer with us?
I was just going to add here in Australia, and I know it would be similar in some countries, not all countries, like the UK specifically. Most diabetes organisations now have advisory panels associated with them. So here in Australia, like the Australian Diabetes Educator Association, which is like our body that supports us diabetes educators, the Australian Diabetes Society, which is the body that supports the endocrinologists, Diabetes Australia, JDRF in various countries, Diabetes Victoria, so your individual state or territory, depending on what country you're in, diabetes organisations, similar structures in other countries. They all have community advisory groups that you can be a part of to help steer the shape of where research is directed. But I put it to the community to go out and start those conversations. If the organisations themselves aren't starting those conversations, then there's no reason why community themselves can't pick up the phone, give your local organisation a call and say, hey, have you ever thought about starting a more formalised research group only, where it's very much either led by community or it's a real balance of community and clinician/clinician researcher collaboration. I know if I picked up the phone today and spoke to Diabetes Victoria, they would be all for starting such a group. I know if I did the same thing with ADA, and I'm actually now tempted to do that, I just got to find time between that and my thesis to say, hey, we need to start a research group, but it needs to be equal representation of community and clinician/clinician researchers. So pick up the phone. You know, your limit is only as small as your imagination. Put the suggestions out there and go for it.
Love it, Belinda, as always. Thank you for that. Pick up the phone, guys. Jasmine, come to you, and then Diana next, following that conversation with Belinda.
I think that was some brilliant responses, and I have to echo what Jacq said that about networking. But if there's a researcher you really admire, you can shoot them an email and ask, I'd love to get involved with your work. Maybe I started out volunteering for researchers before I started working in that space to get a better understanding of it. Belinda made a really good point about community advisory groups. So I know if you go to like a page like Diabetes Australia, there's often a part of the website that will say get involved in research, that will have ways to participate in research, which include the advisory groups. I've also just tweeted an opportunity. The ACBRD is currently offering 3 PhD scholarships, so you can make your start in diabetes research that way. So I've just tweeted that link in hashtag DiabetesChat if you're interested in those. One will be about people's experiences in hospital with diabetes. The second will be about experience of taking part in research among adults with type 2, and the third will be about diabetes stigma in collaboration of Diatribe.
I will add the fact that you can indeed look in registry. We have the Switch registry in Europe, the T1D exchange registry in the United States. And, you can just, register to the registry. There's some questions, some survey that you can answer, and that help us incredibly for collecting data if we are part of these organizations. Another thing that I can maybe mention is a foundation. For example, at my hospital here in Italy, we do have a foundation. It's called Bambino Gesù, and that is a great opportunity for people to get involved in research. You can text me a PM after a DM. I can give you some information about that. And so everything that can be done to the foundation support our researchers. So that's also something that can be done.
Thanks very much for that, Diane. Tom, was there anything else we wanted to do?
I've just seen a message from Leon as well. He says, following the conversation, really, networking is a big part of it. If you have any ideas, get in front of the academics, and you can join DDoC and things like that, or enter in the DCB Innovation Challenge. You can also join community engagement boards that will connect you to researchers as well. So, lots of advice there, guys. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Jasmine, Jack, Jonathan, Diana, Hilary from JDRF, Dean as well, for your time. Incredible generosity in supporting the Diabetes Chat tonight, in sharing your amazing expertise, all the fantastic research you're doing. But guys, please get in touch with these guys if you have any other follow-up questions, listen back or whatever, and you can contact these guys. I'm sure they will help, and just give them a follow and see all the amazing things that they're doing, because they are truly amazing people. So thank you to the guys for joining tonight.